one accident, one driver without enough insurance. That's all it takes to turn a well-built financial plan into a financial disaster, especially if you don't have the right protection in place. On today's episode of The Retirement Engineer, we're talking about one of the most overlooked and critical forms of insurance: underinsured and uninsured motorist coverage. Now, if you've never thought much about it, you're not alone. But by the end of this episode, you'll know why it matters, how it works, and what steps you should take to make sure you and your retirement plan aren't left exposed. So, Jim, please introduce today's guest.
Thanks, Patrice. And today's guest is Mike Kane. And Mike, good to see you again. I met Mike a few months ago. He and I both belong to an organization that's a group of entrepreneurs, business people from all walks of life. And Mike that day gave a 10-minute talk. It's similar to a TED Talk. And it was incredibly impactful. I've seen hundreds, if not many hundreds of these 10-minute talks. And it was really funny because I was compelled to take action even before Mike was done with this 10-minute talk. And the most interesting thing is when Mike was finished, and we had question and answer, there were so many people who kind of stood up and said, hey, I just reached out to my insurance agent, or I'm having them review my coverage, or I've just increased my coverage. So I thought, look, if I found this of importance, and clearly I felt there was some gap in coverage, I wanted to bring Mike in to share some of these issues with all of you, if for no other reason than just, hey, here's the information, take a look at it, see if you might need to consider some modifications and adjustments. So before we bring Mike on, just by way of introduction, and let me get this right. So Mike is a Colorado personal injury lawyer specializing in auto and truck accidents, as well as personal injury litigation. Mike has spent his entire career fighting for the vulnerable against the powerful. He's a third-generation attorney. There must be some stories there. And as I said, a Colorado native. Former U.S. Marine. Thank you for your service. He served a tour in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. After leaving the military, he returned back to Colorado and served as a deputy district attorney in both the Arapahoe as well as the Douglas County DA offices. He then entered civil practice and is focused exclusively on representing those injured plaintiffs. So welcome to the podcast, and it's great seeing you again, Mike. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate that kind introduction, and it's great seeing you again. Thanks for having me on.
You betcha. This is so interesting because this is, like, I'm a financial advisor. I understand insurances, although I don't participate in or are licensed in auto or homeowners. I know enough to be conversant. And I found this to be just a huge gap in coverage that just simply goes kind of unnoticed. Why do you suppose, as somebody who practices in this space, why do you think it falls under the radar so often?
It's a great question. And I think, one of the primary reasons is when people are purchasing insurance, and specifically car insurance, the state requires that you have liability insurance. And so everybody is thinking, when it comes to car insurance, they're thinking, how do I protect myself if, God forbid, I cause a crash and I am liable for that? So how do I protect my assets? And also the state requires that I have this coverage. And even the most sophisticated individuals that you or I know, including you, and a lot of our colleagues that were at that meeting, just don't know what this other coverage is that we're going to talk about today, because it's not at the forefront. It's not required. You can waive it. You don't have to have it at all. And so I think that's why people are always thinking, how do I protect myself from liability? And they're not thinking, how do I protect myself if someone who doesn't have insurance or is woefully underinsured, God forbid, hurts me or someone in my family?
Right. It's funny. I think for those who think of it from a liability point of view, they're actually putting some work in, and they're actually thinking in a bigger scale. I think to think really small on this, it's like, well, I've got to have some coverage in case I get into an accident to get my car back up and running again, or to replace my vehicle, which is really a small way of thinking about this problem. So this issue that we're talking about, and Patrice kind of teased it, is this whole idea of uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. The term alone, I suppose, if you had no idea what this was, you could sort of guess what this might be. But what exactly does this coverage do, and who exactly does it really protect?
Right. So we call it UM and UIM. So it's uninsured motorist coverage, underinsured motorist coverage. And so there's two primary types of coverage. Obviously, we've already touched upon the liability coverage. And this is separate and apart from liability coverage. So this is coverage that you purchase with your own automobile policy. And it kicks in if someone who either doesn't have insurance, which is the uninsured motorist portion of it, or doesn't have enough insurance to protect you and cover you for all the damages that they've caused, the underinsured coverage kicks in. So I like to tell people it's an umbrella, not an umbrella like you would have for liability, but it's there to protect you. It's a layer of protection above and beyond the liability coverage that you have with your own policy.
Okay, very good. In your presentation, you had a number of stats and some really interesting stories, and we'll get into a few of those in just a second. But as a takeaway, one of the stats that I thought was really quite interesting and a bit shocking was, I think you had mentioned something like 1 out of every 8 motorists out there just have no coverage at all. And of those that do, 1 out of every 3, which is a pretty sizable pool of drivers, have just the state minimum coverage. So there's not an awful lot of folk running around that have adequate insurance coverage. The state minimums are really small. They're 25,000 typically of bodily injury. In today's world, that just doesn't seem like it goes very far. Can you put into perspective what that means relative to the risks that we're assuming here, should one wind up in an accident and require some level of medical care?
Sure. And a lot of people, I get the question, well, how is it even possible that people don't have car insurance? Because as you and all your listeners and clients know, when you go register your vehicle, it's required by every state that you need to show proof of insurance, and that's a requirement. Unfortunately, they don't track that after you do your registration. And so what happens is some of these individuals, up to 18% in some states, will purchase a low premium policy on a month-to-month basis. And they will purchase that policy just so after they buy a vehicle, they can go get license plates. And they show their proof of insurance, and then they just don't pay their premium anymore, and let it lapse because they think, well, that's an unnecessary expense for me. Why would I have to pay for insurance? And so that's how there are so many uninsured drivers in our country. And then you touched on, Jim, the amount of drivers that just have the state minimum. And so my home state of Colorado is 25,000. I think Michigan is 25,000. I think Florida is only 15,000. I may be wrong on that. It used to be 15,000, but let's just say the minimum is $25,000. And like you mentioned, I represent people who are generally pretty seriously injured. And so just an emergency department visit this day and age, And if they have to do scans, and if they have to do an MRI, and if you need more than just get checked out and sent on your way, you're looking at $25,000 to $50,000 just for that initial set of scans from the emergency department. So that $25,000 of minimum coverage that so many people have, that's barely going to touch the initial medical bills. And then if you're seriously injured and you miss work and you have extensive rehabilitation, if you need surgery, the bills become astronomical at that point. So that's why this coverage is so important for everybody to have.
Amazing. I was doing, in anticipation of our talk today, I was kind of going down a couple rabbit holes on uninsured motorist and what that looks like, and just kind of getting a better sense. And there was an article I was reading. It was written just a month or two ago about large urban areas. And while you have 1 out of 8 uninsured motorists, which is a hugely large number, they were saying relative to the Detroit area, and I'm not exactly sure whether that was Detroit proper. I'm outside of Detroit here in Michigan. They said it could be at any point in time as many as 1 out of every 2 drivers, which is just
Right.
an absolute scary thought.
And that's scary. And I tell people all the time, think about when you get in your vehicle and you get on the interstate to drive to work or go see family members. 1 out of every 7 vehicles, maybe 1 out of every 2 vehicles you see has no insurance. And so it's scary. That's why you need to be protected. And that's why I do these talks. I'm not an insurance salesman.
Right.
I don't run an insurance brokerage, but I've seen it so many times where people who are sophisticated, smart, try to do everything right, just miss this, and they just don't know this is there. And then tragedy strikes and they don't have the proper coverage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems to be somewhat confusing too, with the layering of all the desperate, unique kinds of coverages one can have as well. That this still is a gap that can fall kind of underneath these coverage umbrellas. So you might think you're perfectly covered and you're not. This whole idea of UIM, though, is there kind of a story behind that? How did you generally get involved? Because you're really passionate about getting the message out that people really need to take a closer look at what their coverage limits are. Why are you such an evangelist?
It's because I've seen it too many times. And like you said, I've been doing this for quite a while now. And, I represent people who get hurt through no fault of their own. And so it's people who are just minding their own business, abiding by the law, and they either get hit while they're driving or hit as a pedestrian or on a bicycle. And then all of a sudden, just like that, in a blink of an eye, their whole life changes. And so as part of my job is to make sure that I obtain compensation for them to cover those injuries that were not their fault. And so obviously the first thing that we look at is, well, what is the liability insurance? Is it a personal policy? Is it a commercial policy? So we always look at what's the liability coverage. But then if that coverage is not sufficient, or if there isn't coverage there, then we look at and you make a claim on your own UIM policy. And so I started to become so passionate about this because I saw too many of my clients who just didn't know until it was too late that they didn't have coverage. They either waived it, or they only had the minimum, or they had a very small amount that did not compensate them for their incredible damages. And so I've kind of taken upon myself to speak with anybody and everybody I can to make sure that they are protected and they are covered.
Because the worst thing that you could find happen is when tragedy hits, the person at fault, presuming it's not you, just doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the coverages to even be able to make claim on. And if you could win in a court situation, there still aren't any assets there to garner. So as a kind of the last line of defense, let's make sure that we ourselves have at least some degree of adequate coverage to call upon should tragedy hit, right?
That's exactly right. Because, the people who are purchasing minimum insurance or the people who let their insurance lapse, they're probably not the most responsible people
Mm.
out there. And so you're not going to be able to pursue a personal judgment against those individuals. And so, like you said, Jim, that's why you need to make sure you're protected and you take the steps to protect yourself.
A lot of our listeners, many are engineers and scientists, folks who have worked their career or are still working in large corporations. Others are professionals, self-employed or otherwise. I know that you had a number of really compelling stories, it kind of compacted into this 10-minute talk. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a story you told about a young, I think it was maybe I might not be right about the profession, but I thought she was like a young attorney, maybe who got into a severe accident, and just the need for resources was really quite surprising. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit on what that story was all about?
Sure. It's one of many that I have that are so sad, but this particular one, like you said, she was an amazingly successful, sophisticated lawyer here in Colorado, and she was training for a marathon. And she was out with her Irish setter on a beautiful Denver morning, out for a jog, and a drunk driver crossed over the road and hit her while she was on the sidewalk. And so, she was flung into a tree, knocked unconscious. She had a traumatic brain injury. She was taken to the ambulance. The drunk driver, as you may expect, did not have sufficient coverage. He had $25,000 of coverage on his liability policy and no real assets. And so she hired me to represent her for this. And when we looked at her inventory of insurance, she only had $250,000 of UIM coverage. Now, that sounds like it's a lot of money, $250,000. But if you look at the extent and the severity of her injuries, she was in the hospital for weeks, and she had to have extensive outpatient therapy. And because of the traumatic brain injury, she was not able to work for more than 4 hours a day. And this was a successful, bright, sophisticated lawyer. And when I had to break the news to her that there was only $275,000 of insurance, she couldn't believe it because she just didn't know that the UIM coverage was lacking. And her medical bills alone were over $300,000. And that's just the medical bills. And that didn't take into account the pain and suffering, the impairment she had, the lost wages from not being able to work. And so that's just one story that I tell is, even someone who's sophisticated, like an attorney, like a financial advisor, like an engineer, like, you name it. They just don't know about this. And if you're seriously injured, you're not going to have the protection that you need. And if there's no other source of recovery, unfortunately, you're really out of luck, which is so sad.
Right. I think one of the big concerns, and probably the reason this goes kind of under the radar screen, is there's a significant amount of confusion. At least I was certainly confused as to just where coverages are, where they kind of start and kind of where they end. I've got medical coverage. I've got Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. I would assume in the event I were injured, I could make a claim against that. I've got a liability umbrella. I don't know if there's any possibility of making medical claim against something like that. And then to make it even more confusing, we're here in Michigan. I know there are a lot of listeners outside of the state. Colorado, for example, is not a no fault, but an at fault or a tort state. And many of the states that we all enjoy from Michigan leaving in the inclement weather to spend time, Arizona, Texas, Florida is an exception. They're no fault as well. Tennessee, these are all at fault or tort states. But here in Michigan, we're required to also have PIP, which is personal injury protection, which is kind of another layer of protection. But how, I guess, if you're an uninsured motorist, and they're at fault, you could still make some degree of claim on your PIP. Is the issue there that those are also really small limits and you can kind of blow through that pretty quickly?
Correct. That's exactly right. And like you mentioned, there are so many layers, and it can become confusing. And another story that I told is that I was talking to a friend about this, and he's actually a member of the group Genius Network that you were talking about. And he had a multi-million-dollar umbrella coverage for liability purposes. And when we looked at what his UM/UIM coverage was, it was only $100,000, and he just didn't know that even what it was. And again, a very sophisticated individual, very successful individual. And so those minimum coverage that you were talking about, Jim, they're not even going to pay for the initial hospital visit if you've got to go in and get checked out. And fortunately, if you're okay, that's great. But you're going to have these medical bills. And health insurance does provide coverage for the bills. But what happens is if there's a third party claim, which means you didn't just slip on your own patio and get injured, it was your own fault. If somebody else hurts you, health insurance providers have what's called subrogation. And that means they can get paid back out of a settlement or a recovery for the injured person for what they paid in benefits. And so, yes, you have the health insurance to initially cover the bills, but if you do recover money through a settlement or a judgment, the health insurance company, Blue Cross Blue Shield, gets paid back what they provided in benefits. And so health insurance coverage is not going to provide any compensation for anything above just what those bills were. So no lost wages, no long-term care, no pain and suffering or physical impairment damages.
Okay. Yeah, I can see where that not only is confusing, but it lends itself to these big, huge gaps. I can remember in this talk, you had also mentioned, just kind of reducing this to the ridiculous, that the cost for this coverage, and I know, you're not an insurance agent. I don't participate or practice in this area either. Best thing to do always is reach out to a competent agent with these types of questions. But it seems like the cost for $1 million worth of this coverage is kind of the cost that you might pay for a halfway decent dinner, once a year or so. It sure seems to me that the benefit of improving the coverage compared to what the risks are that we're dealing with, they're so different and so immense that it certainly makes some sense to take a closer look at this. I bet in your career that you've seen, cases that have gone into the millions of dollars worth of expense and judgment as a result of just raising costs and just the ridiculousness of medical costs these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And when the last time I had a friend who called to say, what is it going to cost to get $1 million of UM/UIM coverage? Because that's my recommendation, is if you can afford it, I recommend having a minimum of $1 million. I hope you never need to use it,
Right.
but it's better to have it there than not have it there. It ended up being less than $100 a month to add that coverage, because a lot of these carriers, whether it be State Farm, Allstate, Farmers, Travelers, all the big insurance carriers, if you've got your liability coverage already with them, and if you've got a business policy, and if you've got your umbrella, to add on the UMUIM is not that much because they offer those bundle discounts. And so it's really not that expensive. And the good thing about this is that it goes with you. And so if you are in Arizona, and, tragedy strikes and you're injured, that coverage goes with you. So it follows you. It also covers members of your family. And so there's something called resident relative. So if you have family members living in your home and they're permissive users of your vehicles, which means you allow them to drive your vehicles, they're covered under the policy as well. So it's really, like you said, Jim, it's a relatively low cost for such a huge upside in protection.
Well, to your point, when I visited with my agent and we kind of walked through this, I don't exactly remember what the cost was, but because I had a very large liability umbrella policy with them already, the cost was really insignificant to add this. And it would have been, and they pointed out the fact that it would have been significantly more expensive had I not had the other coverages. So it's always a good idea to check that out. So with that, if someone's listening and saying, gee, I don't know if I'm covered or not, or do I have this or not, what would you say would be the very first step?
Yeah, the first step is call your insurance broker right now, and just ask the question, what do I have? First of all, do I have uninsured, underinsured bodily injury coverage? Yes or no? If no, immediately say, well, can you please send me quotes for various levels of coverage? I recommend $1 million. That's just my recommendation, but please send me quotes. If the answer is yes, you have UMUIM, then the next question is, how much coverage do I have? And then what will it look like if I want to increase my limits of coverage? So immediately contact your broker and ask the question, just like you did, Jim. What do I have, and what's it going to take to get me more protection if I'm not covered the way I want to be?
It's interesting because these are all separate decisions. UM, UIM is separate from in Michigan. There's also a separate selection with PIP, and those all have ranges as well. And I remember I had a very large, whatever the top range was, I think it was $1 million of PIP. But what I had for uninsured motorist was like, it was, if not the lowest rung, the next lowest rung. I just didn't even think about it. Like, oh, this is a scam, or, this is something I really don't need because look at all the PIP I have. So we certainly are at a position today where I think I'm much better protected than I would have been. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And that happens a lot because, the PIP coverage and the liability coverage are required. So that's what you were thinking of. Well, I would need to make sure I follow the law and to get what's required, and just had this gap where you didn't understand what this other layer of coverage was.
Right.
It happens all the time.
Yeah. Well, this is a great topic for this type of a podcast because we're all about helping clients build bigger, bolder retirements. And building this type of retirement, it's not just simply about growth of capital. It's about protecting the assets we've accumulated. It's about protecting ourselves from other liabilities or claims that can be put upon us, which can have a major effect on retirement. So in your opinion, as one is sort of facing retirement planning and making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, I imagine that you would be a big proponent at making sure that we're particularly squared away with respect to insurances as it relates to auto, bodily injury, liability.
Absolutely, because the last thing that anyone wants to do is to use their hard-earned investments and retirement funds to pay for damages that they didn't cause because they didn't have enough insurance coverage to provide compensation for that. And the person who hurt them didn't have enough insurance coverage. That is, pretty catastrophic. And unfortunately, I have seen that where someone gets seriously injured, permanently injured, and they're relatively young, or they're even, a little bit older, nearing retirement age. And the damages exceed all insurance coverage. And then all of a sudden, they're having to dip into their savings and their retirement. That's catastrophic for, your wealth and your retirement goals. And so, you don't want to put yourself in that position. And that's why I am passionate about this, to make sure that you're covered in every way. And especially when it comes to protecting yourself. If 1 out of 7 of those uninsured drivers, or the 33% of minimum insured drivers, injures you or one of your family members, God forbid, you have the peace of mind that you're protected.
And I would imagine one of the scariest positions to be in is having an accident. You got the insurances and whatnot to help kind of put you back together again, but your lifestyle, your quality of life might require a considerable amount of help along the way, whether that is rehabilitation or aid care or whatever. That the long-term nature of that can be incredibly devastating in terms of a retirement plan and how much cash flow we need to generate to be able to do that. It can literally take a perfectly good plan, which has high margins for success, and jeopardize the plan completely.
Right. And like we've mentioned, the cost of these things are only going up. And when I say these things, I mean healthcare, rehabilitation. It's just, they're not going down. They're just going up. And so the last thing you want is to jeopardize all the work that you've put in your retirement planning because of something like this. That's the last thing you want, because it is so expensive. And there's also the quality of life issue as well, that, we spend a lot of time just talking about the medical costs, but there's also, significant pain and suffering and quality of life issues, disfigurement issues. And those are all covered under a UIM policy. Those categories of damages are covered under those policies. So that's why it's just so important.
Yeah.
In my mind.
You talk about rising cost. I literally just an hour and a half ago, I had a conversation with one of my team members. I won't mention their name or what have you, but they had a child who in the spring was jumping off of a swing, fell, compound fracture to the arm. So the child was in a cast for a period of time and whatever else. It was just, it's like a common kid breaks their arm. It happened to be a compound fracture. But she had mentioned that she's still waiting on a number of additional bills coming in. They're being covered by insurance, obviously. But she's already up to, I think she said, $67,000 or $68,000 worth of medical care that's been provided for, a broken arm. Let's reset it, reset the bone, cast it up, and we should be good to go. Just crazy. Imagine what those costs are if it's something that's far more extensive.
Yeah. And I mean, I actually have a client right now who was hit, fortunately not too hard, but she was hit on one of those electric scooters. And so she was riding a scooter in a crosswalk, and a guy just didn't see her and turned and hit her. Fortunately for her, no broken bones, no head injury. It was a relatively lower impact collision, but they took her to the hospital to get evaluated, and no broken bones, no surgeries, no overnight stays, nothing like that. $78,000.
My goodness.
For that. So her medical bills are $78,000 for that. And I know that's high, but it's not her responsibility. That she did nothing wrong. They took her by ambulance and took her to the hospital, and she's stuck with this bill now.
Yeah.
Which just kind of highlights your point about how crazy it is.
Yeah.
how expensive this stuff is.
So bottom line, reach out, have a conversation with your insurance agent, and see exactly where you fit on this matter. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. This has been really informative. It's exactly what we wanted to impart to our clients. So thank you. You get the last word. So is there anything else, last parting shot? By the way, all of your contact information, how we can get a hold of you, all that will be in the show notes. I'll make sure that everybody has access to that. But if there's one last word of advice you'd like to provide, what would that be?
I think it's act. A lot of times people think, well, I'll get to that, or I will, down the road at the time of renewal, I'll talk to my agent about that or whatever. Act, because you never know. And, I've become a little paranoid, cynical because of the work I do. I am fanatical about this stuff because I've seen it day in, day in, and day out of people who, are minding their own business and all of a sudden they're seriously injured. And so my advice is act right now, contact your insurance agent and start acting on these steps and make sure that you and your family are protected.
Words of advice. Thank you very much, Mike Kane. Thanks so much for attending, everyone.
You're welcome, Jim. Thanks for having me.
So, if today's conversation raised a few red flags for you, you're not alone. Many people assume they're covered until it's too late. Take 5 minutes this week to review your auto policy. Look specifically for uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage. Ask your agent the right questions, or sit down with your financial advisor to make sure this piece is not being overlooked in your retirement plan. Thanks for listening to The Retirement Engineer. Be sure to follow @Kaydan Wealth on social, subscribe to our podcast, and if you found this episode helpful, share it with someone you care about. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to The Retirement Engineer with Jim Kruzan. Click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. Visit our website at www.kaydanwealth.com or give us a call at 800-638-6900. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of Jim Kruzan and this episode's guests, not necessarily those of Kaydan Wealth Management. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.